the age of not even 30, Alexander the Great managed to control a territory that stretched from Europe, across Africa, and far into Asia. He conquered 3 continents in a time that no king had ever imagined before. From Egypt to Persia, from the dry desert to the snowy mountains, Alexander was always at the forefront of his army, forcing the world to recognize him as a strategic genius who was almost impossible to defeat. But the question is, how could a young man move so quickly and conquer 3 continents at once? How could his troops win time and time again in every major battle they faced? And what really happened before the final seconds of his life? Together with the Dark Crown, together we dive deeper into the story of a young man who managed to conquer 3 continents at once. The history of the world has never seen a greater fire of ambition than this young man. Born in Pella in 356 BC, Alexander was more than just the son of a Macedonian king named Philip II. His mother, Queen Olympias, instilled in him a mystical belief from the time he was in the cradle, that he was no mere mortal, but the son of the god Zeus, destined to shake the world. But brawn alone was not enough for a future ruler of Asia. His father gave him the greatest teacher history has ever known, the great philosopher Aristotle. In a place called Mysa, under the shade of an olive tree, Alexander learned not only about military strategy but also about medicine, logic, and classical literature. Aristotle gave him a copy of Homer's Iliad, a book he would always keep under his pillow, a symbol of his desire to surpass the heroism of Achilles. The moment that determined his destiny came when he was 12 years old. A merchant brought him a giant black horse named Bucephalus, a horse so wild that none of Philip's generals dared approach. But young Alexander noticed something no one else saw: the horse was afraid of its own shadow. Calmly, he turned Bucephalus's head toward the sun, banishing the frightening shadow, and with a single bound, he rode gracefully away. His father, King Philip, wept with emotion and said, "My son, find a kingdom big enough for your ambitions. Macedonia is too small for you." Those words were both a curse and a promise. As he grew, Alexander became a man with a thirst for knowledge but a cold demeanor. He watched his father build the deadly phalanx, he saw cavalry tactics developed, and he learned one crucial lesson: that a leader must always be at the forefront. Before his beard was fully grown, the foundations of a military genius were laid. This was the beginning of a storm that would sweep ancient civilizations forever. In 336 BC, tragedy rocked the heart of Macedonian power. During a lavish wedding celebration at Aegi, King Philip II was stabbed to death by his own bodyguard. The world stared at the 20-year-old Alexander. Amidst the chaos and the threat of a power struggle, he showed no hesitation. With the lightning support of senior generals like Antipater, Alexander quickly secured the throne. However, the real challenge came from within the palace and the Greek city-states that were attempting to rebel. Merciless, Alexander carried out an internal purge to eliminate any faction that threatened his position. The climax came as he marched south toward Thebes. To send a stark warning to all of Greece, Alexander razed the rebellious city to the ground. His message was clear: though young, he was no shadow of his father. He was a new, more assertive ruler, ready to lead Macedonian armies to conquer the East. In 336 BC, tragedy rocked the heart of Macedonian power. During a lavish wedding celebration at Aegi, King Philip II was stabbed to death by his own bodyguard. The world stared at the 20-year-old Alexander. Amidst the chaos and the threat of a power struggle, he showed no hesitation. This is where Alexander's genius was revealed. He saw the Persian cavalry trapped by the sloping terrain on the riverbank, making it difficult for them to move freely. Without waiting for the next day, Alexander led his companion cavalry directly into the fast-flowing river under a hail of enemy arrows. The battle turned chaotic and brutal. At one critical moment, Alexander nearly fell to the sword of a Persian nobleman, but his life was saved just in time by Quintus the Black. This extraordinary bravery galvanized the Macedonians into ascending the escarpment and breaking the Persian line. The victory at the Granicus was more than just a military triumph. It was proof that the god of war was now on Alexander's side, paving the way for the conquest of Asia Minor. In 333 BC, Alexander finally met the Persian king Darius III face to face on the narrow plain of Issus. Statistically, Alexander was at a huge disadvantage. Darius's army was much larger and could have circumvented his position through the Amanus mountain pass. However, Alexander was fortunate in the geography of the terrain. At Issus, the tight space forced the massive Persian cavalry into a tight spot, eliminating their numerical advantage. Alexander keenly noticed a small gap in the center of the Persian line as the enemy forces moved. Wasting no time, he led his companion cavalry in spearhead formation, charging straight into the heart of the defense where Darius stood. The moment Darius saw Alexander staring at him from close range amidst the din of battle, the Persian king's courage crumbled. Darius chose to flee in his chariot, leaving his treasure and family behind in the camp. This flight symbolized the collapse of morale for the entire Persian army. Issus was not simply a tactical victory for Alexander, it was a statement to the world that the Persian Empire was no longer an invincible force. After breaking Darius' morale at Issus, Alexander moved to secure the Mediterranean coast. However, the city of Tyre stood in his way. Tyre was an impregnable island fortress, surrounded by 150-foot-high walls in the middle of the sea. Without a sufficient fleet, Alexander did something considered insane. He had his troops build a giant stone embankment a kilometer long to connect the mainland to the island. For 7 months, a brutal siege ensued. Tyre was pelted with projectiles while the Macedonians struggled on the embankments, battered by enemy ships. When the walls finally broke, utter destruction was inevitable. The city's inhabitants were sold into slavery and the rebel leaders were executed. Tyre fell, leaving other cities in its path in fear. However, a different fate awaited in Egypt. The Egyptian people, tired of Persian oppression, welcomed Alexander as a liberator. It was here, in the middle of the desert of the Shiva oasis, that Alexander met the priest of the temple of Ammonius. He emerged with a new title, Son of Ammonius, the incarnation of God on earth. Alexander was no longer just a conqueror, he had become Pharaoh, the ruler who now had heavenly legitimacy. In 331 BC, Darius III was no longer running away. He gathered the entire might of his empire at Gaugamela, a vast plain leveled specifically to allow the Persian cavalry and chariots to move freely. Darius was confident that this massive force would spell the end for Alexander. However, Alexander displayed calm in the midst of the storm. As the Persian cavalry attacked his flank, Alexander coolly moved his troops diagonally. This maneuver created a fatal gap in the center of the Persian defense. Without hesitation, Alexander led his companion cavalry in a spearhead charge aimed straight at the heart of Darius' command. Seeing Alexander coming like a storm straight towards him, Darius' courage collapsed. For the second time, the king turned and fled, leaving his troops out of command. With the fall of Gaugamela, Persia was no longer an empire, it was just territory waiting to be conquered. Babylon and Susa were wide open, giving Alexander untold treasures that financed the remainder of his campaign towards the east. After Gaugamela, Alexander conquered Persia's ceremonial center, Persepolis. Here, Alexander faced a controversial moment. He ordered the magnificent palace burned. For many historians, this was a symbolic act, revenge for the Persian burning of Athens in the past. The flames that consumed the golden columns were a message that the old era of Persia was over. Meanwhile, Darius III fled to the east, but a terrible fate awaited him. Instead of being protected by his own people, he was captured by Bessus, one of his ambitious governors. As Alexander gave chase across the desert, the desperate Bessus ordered his men to finish Darius off so he wouldn't fall into Alexander's hands alive. Alexander finally arrived to find his former archenemy dead in his chariot. He showed not anger, but final respect. He ordered Darius buried according to Persian royal tradition. For Alexander, this was a shrewd political move. He wanted the world to see him not as a destructive invader, but as the rightful successor to the Persian throne. At the height of his power, Alexander began to change. He was no longer a fully Macedonian king, but a ruler who began to adopt Persian luxuries and traditions. This change created a gap between him and his old officers who remained loyal to Greek traditions. Tragedy erupted in Maracanda during a fatal drunken orgy. Clitus the Black, the loyal general who had saved Alexander's life at the Granicus, openly criticized the king's change of heart. In a fit of uncontrollable emotion, Alexander seized a spear and stabbed his own friend to death. The room froze. Alexander realized his mistake, but his regret came too late. He wept for days, shut himself away, and refused to eat. But the wound would not heal. The trust of his troops began to crumble. They no longer saw the king as a wise hero, but as a tyrant who could kill his own friends in an instant. Beneath his golden crown, Alexander began to feel lonely and lost control of those closest to him. Alexander's ambition drove his army across the Hindu Kush mountains to the banks of the Hydaspes River in India. There, King Porus awaited with a formidable array of war elephants, something the Macedonians had never encountered before. Amidst a torrential rainstorm, Alexander made the risky river crossing. The Battle of the Hydaspes was one of the bloodiest. Indian elephants went on a rampage, trampling infantry lines and scaring cavalry horses. However, with great discipline, Alexander's troops managed to injure the legs and eyes of the giant beasts, causing them to turn on their own troops. Alexander was victorious, but at a terrible cost. On the banks of the Hyphasis River, exhaustion reached its peak. After 8 years of warfare and thousands of miles of travel, the loyal soldiers finally rebelled. They refused to advance further into the unfamiliar interior of India. With a heavy heart, the world conqueror was forced to stop. He erected 12 giant altars to mark the extreme limits of his human ambition. The journey home began, not as complete victors, but as a crumbling army. Alexander's journey home turned into a nightmare as he chose the route across the Gidroja desert. Under the scorching sun and the sand that swallowed his feet, thousands of his loyal soldiers died of dehydration. In the midst of this despair, Alexander performed an iconic act. He threw the water his soldiers had brought to the ground, refusing to drink if his troops could not drink. He chose to suffer alongside them. Having escaped the deadly desert, Alexander returned to Babylon. However, his body was no longer as strong as before. In June 323 BC, after a great feast, the world conqueror suddenly fell ill. A high fever choked his voice. On his deathbed, soldiers filed in just to pay their last respects to the commander who had led them to the end of the world. At just 32 years old, Alexander the Great breathed his last. He left without a clear heir, causing his vast empire to soon disintegrate. But his name never died. From Greece to India, he left an enduring cultural imprint. Alexander not only conquered territory, he conquered time, becoming a legend that will live on as long as human civilization stands.